Hello, I'm Joshua Farnsworth, and today I'm going to show you how to make my version of a classic shaker bench with lapped dovetail braces using just 3 pine stair treads. So over the years I've looked at a lot of antique furniture, and one style of bench that keeps coming back to my eye has been a shaker bench with lapped dovetail braces like this. So I took inspiration from different antique benches and I designed my own version, as you can see right here. But I designed it to be made from just 3 yellow pine stair treads from a hardware store. So you might ask, why in the world did I choose to make a bench out of stair treads? Well, because the yellow pine used in stair treads is typically very clear with very few, if any, knots. And also the treads are 11 inches wide, or 11¼ inches wide, which means no gluing up. They're easy to machine and hand plane, and they're already pretty straight. And they can also be found pretty easily. And they're really affordable, actually. So they cost a little over $10 a tread, for a total of about $30 to $35 for this whole project. And all these reasons make stair treads really the perfect choice for someone who wants to make a quality bench on a budget. So where can you find stair treads? Well, for this project, you can head to any hardware store, including the big box stores like Lowe's or Home Depot. And just make sure you buy treads that are 48 inches long. And before I jump into showing you how to build this bench, I want to let you know that you can make this bench with any dimensions. You could design it just like I designed it. But I created very detailed plans for this bench, which can be purchased for only $5. I wanted to make it affordable for pretty much everybody. You can find the link to buy the plans in the description below this video. And in this build tutorial, I use both hand tools and power tools. But if you want to just use hand tools, you can always watch my video and check my article out on squaring up your lumber using hand tools, which I'll also include in the notes below this video. All right, let's get started. First, I cut off the rounded edges of the stair treads on a bandsaw, or you can use a hand saw, but don't cut it to the final width. Then I use a sliding compound miter saw or a crosscut handsaw to rough cut one of the 4-foot treads in half, and I leave the other 2 treads at their full length of 4 feet. The part I cut in half is used for the bench braces. Next, I use the bandsaw to rip the brace pieces to a rough width to make milling easier. Now comes joining the faces of the boards to make them flat. My jointer only joints boards up to 8 inches wide, but if I remove the spring guard and the cast iron extension, I can joint boards up to 12 inches wide. This is a pretty dangerous method for jointing without a guard, so if you do it at your own risk. And also if you do it, use push sticks to keep your hands away from the cutter heads. Also, don't let any part of your body or loose clothing get anywhere near the cutter head. On the wide boards, the jointing will leave a narrow strip of wood that needs to be planed down, but first I'll joint an edge on the jointer to get a 90-degree edge to the face. I also joint the face and edge of each of the 4 brace pieces. Next, I put a planing stop in my workbench vise and butt the wide boards up against it. Then I use a jack plane with a cambered iron to do some rough removal of the thin strip of unplaned wood. This is rough planing, and I'm just trying to get this thin section lower than the wider section, so don't stress on making it perfect. You can accomplish the same task back at the jointer by moving the fence to its narrowest width. This method is faster than using hand plane, but it's not as fun. I make passes until I can see that the narrow strip is lower than the wide strip. You can see it illustrated here. Now we have a wide area that can ride flat through the thickness planer. Next, I send the 2 wide boards through the thickness planer with the newly flattened board face down. I plane on the first side until I see that the boards have all been flattened. I also plane the 4 narrow brace pieces through at the same time so that they'll have the same thickness as the wide boards. Then I flip the boards over and plane the other sides. This is where you'll see the narrow strip disappear. Now I rip all the boards to their final width on the table saw. I make sure to run the jointed edge against the table saw's fence. I go back to my workbench and I use a fine set smoothing plane to remove the machine marks and the snipe that was caused by the thickness planer. I hand plane both the faces and the edges. Now I use a 12-inch combination square and a fine point mechanical pencil to mark out the legs. The ends of the top board don't need to be perfectly square, but the legs do because I'll be cutting mortises on them to fit into the top board. I use my sliding compound miter saw to make cuts very close to the line, but I leave the line. Because I have a hard time making consistently accurate cuts on wide boards with a chop saw, I get really close to the line, and then I use the square and a very sharp low angle block plane to square up the ends of the legs. I keep going back and forth between the block plane and the square until I see no gaps. Squaring up the ends is especially important on the tops of the legs that will have the mortises cut on them. I do cut the ends of the top board with the chop saw, but I don't spend time perfectly squaring them up because they aren't part of a joint. Now I lay out the through mortises on the underside of the top board. I measure in from each edge, and I make a tick mark where I want the legs to go. Next, I use my combination square to extend a square line with my fine mechanical pencil. And here's one of the cool tricks that I came up with. I set one of the legs up against the pencil mark, and I use 2 heavy but smooth objects to keep the leg boards vertical, like these joiner's mallets. Then I can move the board back and forth to get snug up against the pencil line without the leg board falling over. Then I draw a line right against the other side of the leg board. Using a sharp cutting gauge or a combination square, mark the mortises and tenons in from the edges of the boards. I mark the mortises with an X so there won't be any mistake when cutting them. Now I use the marking gauge to set the tenon size by measuring the thickness of the top board, plus a hair more, so I can have the tenons protrude a tad when the bench is assembled. I take that measurement and cut a line on the leg board where the tenons will go. I use a combination square to make more accurate and square marks across the top of the leg boards. And I flip the combination square so that its fence doesn't hang out over the end. That's a real good hand tool trick. I also transfer the lines down the faces of the board past the cutting gauge line. I like to pencil in the cutting gauge line so I can see where to stop cutting. Next, on the top board, I use a combination square to transfer the precise mortise layout lines around on the other side of the top board. Now you can see that the mortises will align perfectly on both sides of the top board, as will the tenons on the leg boards. Take a dovetail saw and cut the tenons. Just barely leave the pencil mark. Make sure you stop sawing before you hit your baseline. You don't ever want to go over the baseline. Alternatively, you can use your bandsaw to cut the tenons. The advantage of the bandsaw is that you can set your fence and quickly make multiple cuts on both legs. For the cross-grain tenon cuts, I place a wide chisel into the knife line with a bevel toward the waist side and press down. Then I flip the chisel over and cut out a little notch. This notch helps me start my saw cut more accurately. For this cut, I actually prefer to use a cross-cut back saw over a bandsaw, just because I find it gives me a cleaner cut. And you can use a fine-tooth dovetail saw if you don't have a cross-cut back saw. I then clean up the cut with the chisel by paring the wood up to the pencil lines. Now I remove the waste from the legs using a coping saw. And don't feel bad if your coping saw blade breaks like mine. It happens all the time and they're cheap to replace. You can see my favorite blades in the notes below the video. I saw fairly close to the line, but not so close that I risk going over my baseline. When you go over baselines, you'll definitely see it in the assembled joint. I use a holdfast to hold my leg boards down tight onto a sacrificial board, and then I use a chisel to chop out the waste. Try to remove half of the waste before going to the line. And make sure to try and stop halfway through the board so you don't blow out the other end. Then, when you don't have much waste left at all, drop the chisel into the knife line and chop downward, angling the chisel backward just a degree or two to give an undercut. This will ensure that no gunk is in the way when assembling the bench. Flip the board over and do the same thing to remove the waste on the other side. If you see any high spots in the joint, use a chisel to pare a very slight undercut valley. Now move back to the top board to cut the mortises. I like to knife in the mortise lines first to prevent the wood from chipping out when boring the mortises out. Notice how I place the bevel side of the chisel toward the waist. This makes for straighter mortise walls. And I make my cross grain cuts first to prevent splitting when I knife in along the grain. Be really extra careful to not use a mallet or even much hand pressure when chiseling along the grain, or you'll split your board. The first method I'll show for removing the mortise waste is with an antique brace and bit. Use a bit that's smaller than the mortise. Turn the brace until the lead screw of the bit just exits the other side of the board. Flip the board around, stick the bit into the little exit hole, and bore back through the hole. This will prevent the bit from causing blowout. This process is easier and faster when I use a drill press. I like to use a Forstner bit for cleaning out mortises because it gives me a really good clean cut. You can see how this leaves very little wood to remove with the chisel. Then I use two chisels to clean out the mortises, removing a little at a time back toward the layout lines. You'll notice how I eventually set the chisel right in the knife marks that I made before boring the wood out. By leaning the chisel back ever so slightly, it'll ensure that no wood is in the way when inserting the tenons. Now I test fit the legs into the top. Don't try to force it, because it could cause blowout of some wood on the top shoulders of the mortise. If there's a hang-up, I just reach into the mortise and try to pare away some of the wood to allow the tenons to come through nicely. I don't need the joints to fit super tight because I'll be wedging the tenons after the final assembly, which will tighten the joint up. Here you can see that the tenons are slightly proud of the top of the bench, like I mentioned when I was laying out the tenons. This will give me a little extra meat when I wedge the tenons. When you wedge the tenons, be careful to wedge them across the grain, like this, so you don't split the board like firewood. Then I just use a dovetail saw with a thin saw plate so that I can cut a thin kerf most of the way down the tenon. Next I lay out the decorative feet on the bench legs. I measure in from the edges. Then I find the center point by measuring from both sides of the board. I draw a line up to the height at which I want the circle to go. Then I grab a straight edge and I connect the pencil marks. And just so I can see how it'll look, I take a pair of dividers and scribe a circle a little smaller than the size of the Forstner bit that I think I'll be using to bore the hole. You can also just do a triangle without the little circle, or you can just do an arch. This is a decorative design choice, but this is my favorite leg design. Then I head back to the drill press and bore the hole before I cut out the legs. Use the size Forstner bit that looks best to you. Then I cut out the rest of the leg opening with a bandsaw or a bow saw. I'll come back later with a spoke shave or scrapers or sandpaper to clean up the bandsaw marks. I reassemble the bench and ensure the legs are tight against the top. Now comes the layout for the braces. I only lay out and cut 2 joints at a time, so I'll start on this side of the bench first. To get the braces to span at a 45-degree angle, I measure the same distance from the inside of the bench down to the legs as I do down the top. This measurement can be whatever looks good to you as long as you make both measurements the same, unless you don't want the braces to be 45 degrees. That's up to you. I line the brace board to sit right up against these marks. Next, I clamp the brace boards in place using long ratcheting clamps. I then take my combination square to bring the legs square to the top. Then I really tighten down the clamps. Now I take a fine mechanical pencil and draw reference lines at all the spots where the brace intersects the bench. I mark the brace and the bench with a matching mark so that I'll remember which brace goes where and the correct orientation. Then I cut each end of all the braces. I leave about a 1/16 of an inch of wood beyond the outer layout line to make sure the braces aren't too short after assembly. I lay the braces back on the bench, aligning them with the marks I made earlier. Here's a closer look. You can see how I made little tick marks to aid the alignment. After clamping the brace in place, I use a small combination square to extend this line upward. I make a tick mark on the face of the board and use the 45-degree angle fence of my combination square to extend this line on the face of the board. I measure along this line to establish the dovetail. It can be whatever you want, but I thought 2 inches looked good. Then I flip the square around and extend the mark to the end of the brace. Then I mark the waist so I don't make a careless mistake later on. Now you can see how the dovetail will look. If you're using back saws to cut out the dovetail, I place the brace pieces in my workbench vise. I use my square to extend this layout line across the top of the board, and then back down the other side. And again, I mark my waist. Because this cut is 45 degrees to the grain, I can use a rip saw or a crosscut saw. My goal here is to cut as close to the pencil line as possible without removing the pencil line. If you don't feel confident with your sawing skills, then leave a little extra wood and you can use chisels to get down to the pencil line. But since the dovetail is a pattern, don't get stressed out if you accidentally go over your layout line. For this cut, I'm using a crosscut back saw. You could just as easily use a rip back saw. Again, I'm cutting as close to the pencil line as possible while trying to not remove the pencil line. Then I use a wide chisel to clean up the cut and get down to the line in areas where my sawing was off. And here's the dovetail. I found that I can be just as accurate cutting this joint on the bandsaw, if not more accurate, and it saves a lot of time. I just cut very slowly to make sure I leave the pencil line and no more. And don't be fooled by the sped up video. I definitely took my time making this cut. After clamping the brace back in place, I use a marking knife to scribe the dovetail onto the bench leg and top. I use a knife because my chisel will need to fit into the line. Then I set my marking gauge to the thickness of the brace and lock it down. I love this affordable marking gauge because it allows me to double lock the measurement so it won't slip like some other marking gauges do. I remove the clamps and use my combination square and pencil to darken the new layout line. I also draw a square line down the face of the board from both layout lines. I do it on the front and the back of the legs and the top. Next, I use my marking gauge to scribe a line the thickness of my brace boards. I also make this mark on the front and the back. Then I darken these lines with my pencil. And like always, I mark my waist so I don't make a mistake. So here's a close-up view of how the layout lines should look. I grab a wide chisel and place it into the knifed-in line, making sure that the bevel is facing toward the waist. Then I make a few light taps with my joiner's mallet. Then I make my little angled grooves that'll help me start my sawing more accurately. Since this is a cross-grain cut, I like to use a dedicated crosscut back saw. Because it's in the middle of a long board, this cut can't be made on a bandsaw, so you'll definitely want to get comfortable with using a back saw. And accuracy is more important on these cuts, so pay extra attention or you'll have some unsightly gaps after the bench is assembled. And it'll take more time, but you can always cut away from the line and work up to it with a chisel. I make a couple extra relief cuts to make waste removal easier in the next step. Now I use a coping saw to remove the waste, but I take extra care to not get too close to my baseline. If I go over my baseline, it'll be very visible after assembly. Also, I slow way down at the end of the cut so I don't get ugly and highly visible saw curves into the face. I take a chisel and mallet to remove the last bit of waste. I remove half of the waste before dropping the chisel into the knife line. This is extra important when I'm making the finishing cuts in the knife line. That's why I stop using the mallet here and just pair with my body weight. I flip the board over and repeat the same process on the other side. Now I test fit the dovetail braces into the bench. If you just test one dovetail, it'll depress you because it'll appear to have a sloppy fit, but don't worry. It'll be much tighter as you fit both ends of the brace at the same time. And don't get discouraged if you do see some gaps in your assembled joint. It's always possible to hide the gaps later with small wedges. The tight braces want to tug at the mortise and tenon joints, so I clamp the top tightly to the legs before I work on the braces on the other side of the bench. I just do the same thing on these braces as I did on the first two. Now I've got a fully assembled bench and I'm ready to move on to cleaning up the parts and gluing everything up. I grab my smoothing plane and do a final planing to remove layout marks, but I don't plane the parts too much because I don't want to affect the fit of the joints. I also work on other details that would be hard to do after the bench is glued up, like removing bandsaw marks and adding bevels to the feet. Here I'm using a fine cutting rasp to relieve the edges of the feet. In the previous video that I released, I showed a quick tip on how to cut a lot of wooden wedges on the bandsaw in just a few minutes. I'll put a link to that video in the notes below this video. Now it's time to glue the top onto the legs. It's important to get the top seated down all the way before I wedge the tenons. I check all around the bench to make sure there aren't any gaps. Now I squeeze a little bit of glue on the wedge and use the glue brush to spread it around. Then I insert the wedge into the kerf that I cut on the tenon. These tenons are wider than the wedges that I cut, so I use 2 to span the tenon. I use a mallet to drive the wedges down into the kerf, and I stop when I start to feel resistance. It is possible to damage the joint by tapping the wedge too much. Next I glue up the joints for the braces. I add some glue into the top and side pieces and spread the glue around with a glue brush. Then I assemble the dovetail joint. I flip the bench over and glue up the other 2 braces. Here's a closer look at the joint coming together. Now I use 4 clamps to glue up the lap dovetail joints. I've left the bench clamped up for over 4 hours, which is best for yellow pine, and now I'll bore holes into each joint to glue in dowels as extra reinforcement. Here I'm using a traditional brace and auger bit, but I'm extra careful to not angle the bit in a way that the bit will exit and blow out through the bench top. That would be bad. Also, I made a test hole earlier to make sure the dowel would fit snugly. And I personally bored around 2 inches deep for the holes. If using a power drill, I like to use brad point drill bits because I feel like they give a really clean hole. But the bit has to be started very slowly so it cuts cleanly. Notice I used a marker to mark the depth at a little over 2 inches on the bit, the length of my oak dowels. That's my depth stop. I add a minimal amount of wood glue to the dowel with a glue brush. Then I drive it down with a mallet. I stop before the dowel is fully seated so I can wipe the squeeze out so it doesn't splatter all over the place. Then I drive the dowel until it's almost flush. Now it's time to clean everything up. I use a back saw to cut off the wedges, but if you've got a flush cut saw, that's an even better option. I sit on the bench and I use a very sharp, low angle block plane to plane the wedge tenons flush. The low angle is better at planing end grain. I also use the block plane to bring down the protruding dovetail braces. Notice how the sides of the bench are higher than the face of the brace. I'll plane these down with the block plane or a smoothing plane. Then I clean up any details on the rest of the bench, including planing down the dowels and scraping and sanding any squirrely grain. And this is how the finished bench should look. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and I hope you actually go out and make this bench. I want to let you know I may be using this bench in an upcoming video on making milk paint from scratch. Yes, from milk from your fridge. So let me know in the comments below if that's a video you'd like to see. If so, I'll do it. And also subscribe below so you can be notified immediately when my upcoming videos are released. Well, thanks for watching, and now get up from your computer or your phone and go build something. This is Joshua Farnsworth. If you're interested in woodworking with a mix of hand tools and power tools, visit my website at woodandshop.com, where you can find a bunch of free woodworking lessons, workshop tours of amazing woodworkers, and our very popular tool buying guides. You can ask questions and share your projects with thousands of woodworkers on my forum. Enjoy!